Hi everyone, here I am with the next essay, the disciplinary rationale for periodization and a forgotten challenge to it. Of all the essays we've done on periodization, this one begins on a note of conciliatory intent. He seems to want to appease the reader about why periodization exists and the rationale, which is a set of reasons or logical basis for a course of action or belief, the rationale behind why periodization exists. Also, a kind of reminder to the reader that it hasn't been a complete rout or victory. There have been challenges to it which it has withstood successfully, and Underwood provides the reasons behind its resolute status. Ted Underwood's goal in this chapter is to explain the curious stability of the period survey course, known by different names in different times, from philology to literary history to new criticism to post-structuralism, each time like the weak bleat of a goat, a sheep, smothered even before it was heard. However, the bleats have been challenged. Hi everyone, here I am with the next essay, the disciplinary rationale for periodization and a forgotten challenge to it. Of all the essays we've done on periodization, this one begins on a note of conciliatory intent. He seems to want to appease the reader about why periodization exists and the rationale, which is a set of reasons or logical basis for a course of action or belief behind why it exists. Also, a kind of reminder to the reader that it hasn't been a complete rout or victory for periodization. There have been challenges to it which it has withstood successfully, and Underwood provides the reasons behind its resolute status. Ted Underwood's goal in this chapter is to explain the curious stability of the period survey course, known by different names in different times, from philology to literary history to new criticism to post-structuralism, each time like the weak bleat, smothered even before it was heard. However, the bleats have challenged, even though without lasting impact, because the primacy of the period has nevertheless been maintained. Challenged by inclusion of ambitious courses on the history of journalism, strange disciplinary projects like general literaturology, comparative philology, comparative literature, history of ideas that are now nowhere in positions of significance, which means that while they were introduced with much aplomb and fanfare and ambition, they made a tiny impact to change the focus from periods to processes of development. These are the alternative curricular plans deemed necessary for a holistic study of the development of literature without being bound to timelines, as has been the way since study of literature has been introduced. Ted Underwood thinks that these alternatives never grew roots strong enough to succeed as a viable alternative because the acceptability of periodization in the context of sociological ease and convenience has been inadequately defined, what he calls poorly articulated social function. But it seems to hold on despite lack of clarity because it has probably become a comfort zone for literary study to function from. He says the opacity of this phenomenon suggests that it rests on a social foundation not fully articulated as conscious belief, which means that the quality of being obscure in meaning has probably contributed to periodization being what it is, a stable alternative to sporadically erupting ideological opponents to understanding literary history through time and not through history. In this chapter, he decides to focus on one alternative curricular model, and try to figure out the reasons behind its failure. In 20th century America, 1886 to 1930, certain approaches began to gain attention under the name literary theory, comparative literature, general literature. Now, what is literary theory? It is that branch of study which offers various approaches for understanding the role of historical context in interpretation as well as relevance of linguistic and unconscious elements of a text. Now, what is comparative literature? Comparative literature is an academic field dealing with the study of literature and cultural expressions across linguistic, national, geographic, and disciplinary boundaries. Gayatri Spivak defines comparative literature as a result of European intellectuals fleeing from totalitarian regimes. Though it can be said to be a misnomer, considering that in the first decade of the 20th century, there were already departments of comparative literature in Harvard, Columbia, and the University of Chicago. Let us do a little historical jog down memory lane by talking about Richard Moulton, who was professor of literary theory and interpretation in the University of Chicago, heading a department called General Literature, which announced that theory of literature and comparative literature were its central subjects. And guess when this was? This was in the year 1903. That sounds more like how English departments are designed in the present times than, say, the mid-20th century, when these ambitious alternatives, breaking away from the norm, was beginning to die out. Yet, Spivak cannot be very wrong, because the definition of comparative literature in the early 20th century was restricted to national boundaries, or works by different writers belonging to the same country, or even different works of one writer. It was yet to include international writers and a comparison of their works. Ted Underwood chooses to focus attention on the first 30 decades of the 20th century and the possibilities it threw up by the works of people like Posnet, Alistair Mackenzie, George Santayana, Irving Babbitt. Now, explanation rather than description of literary change was the aim of comparative literature in the first 30 decades of the 20th century. H.M. Posnet's book in 1886, Comparative Literature, set the ball rolling, it seems, and called for the introduction of new ideas of study in different universities. Posnet's book was meant to explain the history of literature as occurring contemporaneously with social evolution, from simple and communal to individual and complex. But by 1920, these departments had disappeared, only to reappear as forms aligned to various other forms of literary study after the Second World War. Why was it that the very ambitious project between 1886 to 1920 leaves no traces behind? Ironically, Posnet's book appeared in an international scientific series and aimed to apply historical science to literature. He wished the critic or scholar to understand that not only the parameters by which literature is gauged changes from time to time, but also, and more importantly, there is no single definition of literature itself. He sought to derive lessons and recognize patterns of cultural growth and significance from the aesthetically created works of literary worth. Following in the same manner, Alistair Mackenzie, professor, Kentucky State University in 1911, talked about the primitive, the barbaric, the autocratic, and the democratic phases of literary development, and even referred to that branch of anthropology which is commonly known as literature. This was in keeping with how definitions were changing in those times. Charles Darwin had recently changed biology from a descriptive science to a science of change, and the Scottish anthropologist and folklorist James Fraser had turned from collections of folklore to derive laws of social change. James George Fraser's book, The Golden Bough, written in 1890, documents and details the similarities among magical and religious beliefs around the globe. Now, what on earth could that possibly imply other than the fact that a complete rehauling was taking place of what has been written by poets, playwrights, novelists, essayists into matter for serious study of history? The imagination and aesthetics needed to be separated from the experience and lesson couched in the creative works of these people, reducing every piece of work to cold clinical works which help to establish fact from fiction and history from narrative. Ambitious, yes, because literature had possibly never been subjected to a clinical scientific study. There is nothing to be rational or scientific in an artistic temperament. But Mackenzie even tried to rename literature as literatology on the model of anthropology. Within this very quasi-anthropological ventures, George Santayana, Spanish-American professor of philosophy in Harvard, was relatively belletristic. Belletristic means that he regarded literature as an art with a purely aesthetic function and even considered it to be a vehicle for philosophy. But despite his belletristic approach to literature, he too derived from the works of Lucretius, Dante, and Goethe patterns of cultural development. In Volume 1 of the journal Harvard Studies in Comparative Literature in the early part of the 20th century, he says that they sum up chief phases of European philosophy, that of naturalism, supernaturalism, and romanticism. Remember, the Roman Lucretius was born in 94 BC, Italian Dante in 1321, and German Goethe was born in 1749. Irving Babbitt, a professor in French literature in Harvard, talked about how it should be the ambition of every student of comparative literature to make all attempts to define world literary movements like neoclassicism and romanticism, in terms of one literature. If anybody is trying to define world literary movements like one literature, then those arguments should be shunned because they seem to be one-sided and ill-informed, which probably explains very well why we have so many illustrations from the American academic world discoursing upon English literature. Goes to prove the point of the argument against periodization and the limits of national borders. Comparatists called for a study of continuity, whether across national, linguistic, or temporal borders. Babbitt was one of the few cautioning voices against this university fad in comparative literature, which necessitated the constant search for influence and source and accumulating proof. Very different from the initial aim of Poinsett, who had aimed to explain the transformation of the concept of literature itself from pre-literate times, that means times before society or culture had developed the art of writing. Tracing causal connections in literary study makes it more scientific and explanatory rather than descriptive, as was the design of the early comparative literature scholars. But this constant engaging with sources and influences became its own undoing. Early 20th century comparatists' emphasis on continuity was one of those unsuccessful challenges to periodization. The other reason for its failure was because they did not adequately institutionalize these studies into their curriculum. In many institutions, they managed to create their own departments. In Harvard, Kentucky, Chicago, yet they all began to become like old wine in new bottles. No sufficient anthropological inroads on the basis of clan, city commonwealth, nation, religion were made into literary history. Though there is mention of courses like English influences upon German literature and the development of French comedy in the 19th century, all signifying their inherent capacity to succeed, but the problem of institutional inertia which probably deterred them. The literary curriculum was already organized around nations and periods. To gain entry to the curriculum, comparative literature generally had to borrow faculty from departments of national literature and adapt itself to a periodized structure. That would require a basic restructuring of its approach to literary history. So, periodization was not erased, only slightly decentered in the first 30 decades of the 20th century. John Livingstone Lewis, Norm Foerster, these were names used by Ted Underwood to kind of announce the gradual weaning off from the ambitious socio-anthropological leanings of literary study because of what Lewis calls our interests are becoming special, minute, discrete. Foerster's book, The American Scholar in 1929, says that by trying to portray literature as a developing organism focusing only on heredity, environment, and evolution, questions of value are lost, rendering scholars into what Otto Heller, Dean of Washington University, called robots of learning, who are perpetually scurrying for causal connections, influences, and sources. This brings us to the culmination point of the essay, which brings in Reen Welek and his reaffirmation of the centrality of periodization in literary study. Reen Welek was a Czech-American comparative literary critic, and he is known for systematizing theory of literature with his collaborated work with Austin Warren. The work was Theory of Literature, published in 1948. They divided analysis of literature in two ways: extrinsic, that is relating to factors outside the work, like the author, and intrinsic, relating to factors within the work, like meter and rhythm. To know about Welek's ideas about periodization, it is best to turn to his famous debate with A.O. Lovejoy about the nature of Romanticism. Lovejoy proposed the breaking down of national boundaries and opposing schools of thought into their constituent units, and the task of the historian was to trace those components as they combine and recombine, because no cultural movement is a unified entity. Welek challenged this by reaffirming the unity of European Romanticism in 1940 and again in 1949. He defines Romanticism as a movement having imagination for the view of poetry, nature for the view of the world, and symbol and myth for poetic style. Thus, poetry, world, and poetic style are a unified whole, not meant to be broken into their constituent components. That's because he understands the need for critical evaluation in literary history. His use of words like norms, which guided practice, seem to suggest how important periodization of literary history was to him. He believed that it alone provides an organizing context where evaluation and history can work together. We've already talked about his views on the extrinsic and intrinsic approaches to literature. He even wonders in his struggle to develop a literary theory if it is even possible to club history and literature together. Wouldn't that be a social narration linking events and explaining thoughts with little intellectual merit? He brings in evaluation and values to emphasize the importance of periods. Social categories extraneous to literature is a big no-no. The study of literature must have an intellectual autonomy from other disciplines. He seems to resent the fact that topics like women as healers in medieval life and literature are being accepted by foremost American universities for the doctorate in English. Underwood refutes this all or nothing choice given by Welek in defense of disciplinary autonomy, but also agrees with him that without periodization, literature will inevitably be reduced to a province of some other discipline, and culture will be reduced to a mere historical explanation. Underwood brings in Foucault's stand against continuous history as a privileged shelter for consciousness, which could reanimate all those dead activities, and attempts to establish the immortality of the soul. Whereas Foucauldian genealogy is all about systematic disassociation of our identity. Now, genealogy is a historical technique in which one questions the commonly understood emergence of various philosophical and social beliefs by attempting to explain the meaning of discourse in its entirety. Underwood says this approach is a familiar one because even before literary study was institutionalized in universities, writers were representing literary culture as a disassociation of identity that recognized alienated pieces of the self in past social formations. Underwood talks about the widespread amnesia about the whole history of the discipline of comparative literature, makes an indirect hit at Gayatri Spivak's definition of comparative literature as a consequence of World War II. He sums up by reminding that much else about the early 20th century that has been relegated to the confines of a lost memory. The fact that there were experimental courses like the magazine in America in 1920, or motion pictures, their appreciation and their relation to literature in 1939. History, whether it is about life or a subject, gets written by the winners, by the victors. And that's precisely what's happened to the body of debate on applying science to literature by the early comparative literature enthusiasts. He anticipates a repetition of history with debates about scientism and factualism emerging like skeletons in the cupboard in the literature of the present times. So we come to the end of this. I hope it makes you curious enough to read more and arm yourselves with more information about whatever puzzles you. Get back to me with questions. Now, Ted Underwood talks about the fact that disciplines die out unless they are very aggressively included in the institutional curriculum. I think he says that on page 121. They have to be sustained by unremunerated labor. A very significant point to end our lesson with today. To put it bluntly, for anything to be of consequence, hard work without an eye on the reward has to be put in. So read just for the pleasure of learning and you will go far. Thank you.